You've probably seen courtroom dramas in movies. The tense silence, the gavel striking, the judge delivering the final verdict. In films, the accused might hang their head in quiet acceptance, maybe shed a single tear, and then be led away in handcuffs. But in real life, the moment a judge pronounces the words life in prison without the possibility of parole can ignite something primal in a person's mind. For some, it's like a switch flipping. Years of denial, bravado, and arrogance evaporate in seconds, replaced by pure, uncontrollable panic. They shout, they cry, they beg, and sometimes they lash out violently, as if they could fight their way out of a sentence carved in stone. Today, we're going to look at 10 of the most shocking courtroom meltdowns from convicts who completely lost control after being handed a life sentence. #10 Stephen Burns. The scream that stopped the room in 2017. In an Ohio courtroom, 38-year-old Stephen Burns sat stiffly at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the judge with a hollow, almost bored expression. For months, he had been portrayed as cold, unremorseful, and disturbingly calm for someone accused of one of the most brutal crimes in the state. His recent history, the murder of his wife and 2 young daughters. Prosecutors described how Burns, in a fit of rage over his wife's plans to divorce him, taken a hammer and bludgeoned them to death in their home. The details had sickened the jury, but through it all, Burns barely flinched. He smirked occasionally, even exchanged quiet remarks with his attorneys. It was as if the gravity of the trial couldn't touch him. That all changed when the judge began reading the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Those words seemed to pierce the thick armor Burns had been wearing since his arrest. His eyes widened. The smirk vanished. His jaw clenched, and then, like a dam breaking, he exploded. No. I can't die in there. You can't do this to me. His voice cracked into a guttural scream that echoed against the high ceilings of the courtroom. The sound was raw, almost animalistic, and it made several people in the gallery jump in their seats. Burns shot to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a metallic clatter. His hands were cuffed, but that didn't stop him from lunging toward the judge's bench. Court officers rushed in from both sides, wrestling him back, but he kicked at the defense table, sending papers and a glass of water flying. The microphone in front of the judge nearly toppled as Burns thrashed violently, shouting incoherent insults and desperate pleas. In the chaos, family members of his victims began to cry. One woman buried her face in her hands. Another stared straight ahead, her lips pressed tightly together, as if refusing to give Burns the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. The outburst lasted nearly 3 minutes, but to those in the room, it felt much longer. Eventually, officers managed to drag Burns out, his screams fading down the hallway until the heavy door slammed shut. Later, reporters described the scene as one of the most chilling displays they had ever witnessed. It wasn't just the rage, it was the sudden, naked fear in a man who had spent the entire trial pretending to be untouchable. In that moment, every ounce of control he'd clung to was gone, replaced by the horrifying realization that the rest of his life would be spent in a locked cell. #9, Amber Guyger. The moment the mask cracked. In September 2018, Dallas police officer Amber Guyger walked into the wrong apartment. Or at least, that's what she claimed. She said she believed she was entering her own home when she saw a man inside and, thinking he was an intruder, shot him dead. That man was 26-year-old Botham Jean, an accountant, neighbor, and beloved member of his community. The killing sparked outrage across the country, raising questions about police training, bias, and accountability. When Guyger finally went to trial in 2019, the courtroom was packed with reporters, community activists, and members of Botham's family. The prosecution pushed for a harsh sentence, at one point discussing the possibility of life in prison. Guyger, dressed in a navy blazer, sat with her hands folded, her posture straight, her expression composed, the picture of calm professionalism. She had maintained this image throughout the proceedings, often looking directly at the jury, occasionally jotting down notes, but never visibly reacting to the testimony. That changed the moment the judge uttered the phrase life sentence as part of the discussion of sentencing options. It was into even her final punishment yet. She would ultimately receive 10 years. But just hearing those words seemed to rip away the veneer of composure she'd worked so hard to maintain. Guyger's shoulders suddenly sagged. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead into her hands. At first, she was silent, but then her body began to shake. A choked sob escaped her lips, followed by another and another, until she was openly crying. It was a kind of deep, unguarded sobs that come from somewhere far beneath the surface. Her attorney reached out, placing a hand on her back in a gesture of comfort, but Geiger didn't seem to notice. The room was silent except for the sound of her crying, and the atmosphere was heavy with mixed emotions. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to feel sympathy or disdain. Many of Botham Jean's supporters remained stone-faced, unwilling to let her display of vulnerability alter their view of her actions. What made the moment so striking was indeed just that, Geiger cried. It was how starkly different it was from the image she had projected during the rest of the trial. For days she had been the composed, controlled former officer, relying on her training and discipline to shield her from emotional cracks. But in that instant, the thought of growing old behind bars seemed to crash down on her all at once. It was a glimpse into a reality she clearly feared, but had refused to confront, until the possibility was laid bare in front of her. In the end, she avoided that fate. But those who were there will never forget seeing Amber Geiger's mask break in such a dramatic, undeniable way. Number 8. Cameron Wilson. From defiance to desperation, in the months leading up to his sentencing, Cameron Wilson had carried himself like a man convinced the system could never truly break him. At 31 years old, he had spent more than half his adult life in and out of jails across Washington state, and each time he got out, his crimes grew bolder. Armed robbery, aggravated assault, illegal firearm possession, drug trafficking, witness intimidation. The list was long, but if you'd asked him, he would have told you he was untouchable. Prosecutors painted a far darker picture, a career criminal who thrived on fear, someone who left his victims looking over their shoulders for months, sometimes years after his attacks. During the trial, witnesses described in vivid detail how Wilson had pointed guns at them, beaten them, or threatened to kill them if they testified. The stories were chilling, but Wilson sat there smirking, leaning back in his chair as if the whole thing was a bad TV show. In court, he played the role of the bored tough guy. He yawned during key testimony. He made under his breath comments to his defense attorney that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. At one point, when prosecutors displayed photographs of a crime scene, he actually chuckled. To the families in the gallery, it felt like a slap in the face. He wasn't just denying guilt. He was mocking the pain he'd caused. Sentencing day brought an unusual stillness to the courtroom. Rows of victims and their families sat shoulder to shoulder, some holding hands, others staring straight ahead, waiting for the moment they had been fighting toward for years. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras ready. Even the court officers seemed a little more alert, sensing the weight of what was about to be decided. Wilson entered wearing a white dress shirt that looked freshly pressed. He glanced around, smirked at a familiar face in the gallery, and took his seat like it was just another day. But the moment the judge began to speak, the atmosphere shifted. The charges were read out one final time. The words "armed career criminal" and "pattern of violent conduct" echoed in the room. And then came the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. It took a second to register. At first, Wilson simply stared at the judge, blinking slowly as if waiting for the punchline. But there was no punchline. His fingers resting on the defense table, curled into fists. The smirk disappeared. His eyes darted from the judge to the prosecutor, then to his lawyer, as if searching for some hidden exit from the nightmare. Wait, what? No. That's not. His voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. The judge continued speaking, but Wilson wasn't listening anymore. His breathing grew shallow. His head shook side to side, the muttering under his breath growing louder. No. Until suddenly it burst out in a full-throated shout. You can't do this. I'm not dying in prison. The outburst sent a ripple through the courtroom. Several people in the gallery gasped. One woman whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Deputies moved in quickly, but Wilson was already on his feet, the chair skidding backward. He began pacing in tight, frantic circles, muttering curses at the judge, shouting at his lawyer to fix this, even turning toward the victims' families with a wild look in his eyes. Part anger, part pleading, part something unrecognizable. "Please, I can change," he shouted toward them, his voice cracking. But the rows of stony faces told him everything he needed to know. mercy wasn't coming. When deputies finally stepped in, Wilson didn't swing at them, but he pulled back hard, muscles tensing like a cornered animal. Papers scattered from the table, a water cup toppled and rolled. One officer caught his arm, another grabbed the back of his shirt. They pinned him against the table to apply the restraints. The sound of the Velcro straps on the leg shackles was oddly loud in the silence that had fallen. As they led him toward the side door, Wilson's voice had changed. The anger was gone. Now it was pure desperation. Please don't let me die in there. But the door shut, and the last thing anyone saw was his face. Pale eyes, darting, like a man who had just realized the game was over for good. For the victims and their families, it wasn't joy they felt. It was relief. The fear of seeing him walk the streets again was gone. His meltdown, as unsettling as it was, became the final proof that this time he wasn't walking away. Number 7, Michael Madison, a killer's hollow meltdown. Michael Madison's case was one of the most disturbing to ever hit East Cleveland, Ohio. In July 2013, police discovered 3 women's bodies, each wrapped in plastic bags, in an abandoned garage and nearby lot close to Madison's apartment. The details of the crimes, the methods, the timeline, the sheer disregard for human life horrified the community. Prosecutors sought either the death penalty or life without parole, and the trial became a focal point for conversations about violence against women and the failures of the justice system to stop predators before they escalate. Madison, however, didn't seem fazed. Throughout the trial, he maintained a demeanor that was almost unnervingly flat. He would sit perfectly still, eyes fixed somewhere ahead, not reacting even when the most graphic evidence was displayed. Some described his expression as dead-eyed, others as smug, but either way it didn't change, until sentencing day. The courtroom that morning was packed beyond capacity. Friends and relatives of the victims sat shoulder to shoulder, many wearing pins with the women's faces. Some clutched tissues, others gripped the hands of the people next to them. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that makes even the scrape of a chair sound too loud. When the judge announced that Madison would be spared the death penalty, but would spend the rest of his life in prison without any chance of parole, there was a brief moment of stillness, and then the crack appeared. Madison's lips pressed into a tight line. His jaw worked back and forth. His breathing grew audible. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the judge, and muttered, "This isn't justice." The words were quiet, but sharp enough to carry. Several family members in the gallery immediately shouted back, "Yes, it is, and rot in hell." Madison's gaze flicked toward them, and for the first time, a trace of emotion appeared. Not remorse, but irritation. He raised his voice, talking over the judge. "You think locking me up forever fixes anything?" His tone was accusatory, almost mocking, as if he were the victim in the situation. Deputies moved subtly closer. The tension in the room was climbing, but then something shifted. Maybe it was the finality in the judge's tone. Maybe it was the sight of the deputies waiting to take him away. Whatever it was, Madison's voice faltered. I can't live like that," he stammered. The words hung awkwardly in the air, almost pathetic in their vulnerability. His shoulders slumped. The fire drained from his eyes. He sat back slowly, as though the weight of the sentence had physically pressed him into the chair. The families kept their eyes on him, some crying, others glaring. When the deputies finally escorted him out, Madison didn't look at anyone. His head was bowed, his steps heavy. That hollow collapse, the quiet realization that his world had shrunk to the size of a prison cell, was in its own way more unsettling than the rage-filled meltdowns of others. It was the unraveling of a man who had spent the whole trial pretending to be in control, only to have reality tear through that illusion in an instant. For the victims' families, it wasn't enough to heal the pain, but it was closure. The knowledge that Madison would never again have the power to harm another person. Number 6, Thomas Gilbert Jr. From Ivy League privilege to courtroom collapse on the surface, Thomas Gilbert Jr. was the last person anyone would expect to see in a maximum security prison. Tall, well-dressed, with the refined manners of an East Coast socialite, Gilbert had grown up in the rarefied world of Manhattan's Upper East Side. He attended elite prep schools, went to Princeton University, and enjoyed a trust fund from his wealthy family. But behind the glossy facade was a man spiraling out of control. Friends described him as erratic, entitled, and dangerously short-tempered. In 2015, Gilbert's world imploded when he was arrested for the murder of his own father, a prominent hedge fund manager. The motive. Prosecutors alleged that Gilbert was furious after his father reduced his monthly allowance from $3,000 to $1,000, a move intended to force him to find a job. Instead of adapting, Gilbert allegedly shot his father in the head in the family's luxury apartment, then staged the scene to look like a suicide. The trial drew intense media attention, both for the shocking crime and the bizarre details of Gilbert's life. From his obsessive fitness routines to his history of harassing ex-girlfriends, through it all, he maintained an air of detachment, often staring into the middle distance during testimony as if the proceedings were beneath him. When sentencing day arrived in 2019, the courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and members of New York's high society. Gilbert walked in wearing a navy suit, his hair neatly combed, exuding the same calm arrogance he had shown for years. He sat straight-backed, eyes forward, as the judge recounted the calculated nature of the murder and the devastation it caused. Then came the words that shattered his composure: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gilbert blinked rapidly, his jaw tightened. His hands, resting on the defense table, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. The judge continued, but Gilbert leaned toward his attorney, his voice urgent. "This can't happen. We'll appeal, right? This isn't the end?" But the reality was sinking in fast. His breathing grew heavier, his shoulders rising and falling. "I can't do this. Can't survive there," he muttered, his voice breaking for the first time. His mother, seated a few rows back, covered her face with her hands. As deputies approached to escort him away, Gilbert's mask cracked completely. He began to argue loudly with the judge, insisting the sentence was unfair, that he had been set up, that the truth hadn't been told. The outburst escalated into a rant, his voice bouncing off the marble walls. Deputies flanked him, guiding him toward the holding area as he turned back toward the gallery, shouting, "This isn't over." But it was over. For the first time in his privileged life, Gilbert faced a reality he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. And the weight of that truth was visible in every step he took toward the door. Number 5. Jeremy Christian. A public outburst fueled by hate in May 2017. Portland, Oregon was shaken by a brutal attack on a commuter train. Jeremy Christian, a 35-year-old man with a history of extremist views, began hurling racial and religious slurs at two teenage girls. One of them black, the other wearing a hijab. When 3 men intervened to protect the girls, Christian pulled out a knife and stabbed them. 2 of the men died, and the third was seriously injured. The crime horrified the city and drew national attention, not only for its violence but for the defiance Christian displayed afterward. In court appearances before the trial, he was seen shouting at the victims' families, proclaiming his beliefs, and showing no remorse. He seemed to revel in the attention, wearing his notoriety like a badge. The trial itself was tense and emotionally charged. Survivors and witnesses recounted the terror of that day, while prosecutors argued for the maximum penalty. Christian, representing himself at times, continued to disrupt proceedings with inflammatory comments. When sentencing day came in 2020, the courtroom was filled with grieving families, community leaders, and armed deputies prepared for trouble. The judge read through the charges: aggravated murder, attempted murder, assault, and then delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christian's reaction was immediate and explosive. He laughed, a sharp, unsettling sound that made several people in the gallery flinch. "I've got nothing to lose," he shouted, grinning broadly. "You can't stop my ideas. You can kill me in there, but my words live forever." The judge tried to continue, but Christian kept going, raising his voice over the proceedings. "You think this scares me? You think locking me up changes anything?" His words dripped with venom, but behind the bravado there was a flicker of something else. The realization that he would never again walk free. Deputies moved in, standing close on either side of him. Christian turned to face the families of his victims, smirking. "You hear me? I win." One woman in the gallery shouted back, her voice shaking with rage. "You lose every second you're in that cell?" Yes. Deputies began to escort him out, Christian's tone shifted slightly. The grin faded for just a heartbeat, replaced by a tightness in his jaw, his eyes narrowing as if the weight of the sentence had finally settled in. But then the mask snapped back into place, and he resumed his taunting until the heavy door closed behind him. For many in that room, it was a disturbing display, not just of hatred, but of a man clinging desperately to a persona, because the alternative was admitting defeat. #4. Nico Jenkins. Chaos in the courtroom. In Nebraska's criminal history, few names stir as much shock and fear as Nico Jenkins. In August 2013, just weeks after walking out of prison, Jenkins embarked on a killing spree that left 4 people dead in a span of only 10 days. The murders were cold-blooded, victims shot at close range, bodies left where they fell, and prosecutors argued they were committed for no other reason than thrill and dominance. From the first day of court proceedings, Jenkins made it clear he wouldn't behave like a typical defendant. He demanded to represent himself, fired his attorneys mid-hearing, and interrupted witnesses with bizarre rants. He claimed his orders came from Apophis, the Egyptian serpent god, and insisted the justice system was part of a larger supernatural conspiracy. He carved deep scars into his face with a razor blade while in custody and displayed the words "Cutthroat" tattooed across his neck like a warning label. Security for his 2017 sentencing was on high alert. Deputies in bulletproof vests lined the walls. Bailiffs were stationed at every corner, and a special transport team waited outside. In the gallery, the victims' families sat shoulder to shoulder, some clutching photographs, others holding hands in grim solidarity. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks and cameras ready to capture every unpredictable moment. The judge spoke with steady authority, recounting each murder in chilling detail. She outlined the overwhelming evidence, the impact on the community, and the complete lack of remorse Jenkins had shown. He stared forward at first, eyes unfocused, lips twitching faintly, as though listening to voices only he could hear. Then came the sentence: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Jenkins erupted. He shot to his feet, chains rattling, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "This is all lies. You are all puppets of an evil system." He jabbed his finger toward the bench, his voice cracking with rage. "You re not a judge, you re a devil." The room exploded with tension. One mother broke into sobs, pressing her face into a relative's shoulder. A father shouted back, "You'll rot in hell." Deputies moved quickly, surrounding Jenkins. But he twisted and pulled, kicking the defense table so hard that papers and a pen skittered across the floor. He launched into a bizarre monologue about Egyptian gods and spiritual warfare, his words tumbling over each other in a torrent of anger and delusion. The judge tried to regain control, pounding her gavel, but Jenkins' voice boomed over everything. Even as deputies grabbed him by the arms, he jerked free long enough to snarl, "This sentence means nothing. I'll be free in the spirit world." It took 4 deputies to drag him toward the side door, his shackles scraping against the tile floor. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off his voice mid-sentence. In the stunned silence that followed, the reality sank in. Jenkins' reign of chaos on the outside was finally over, though his volatility would remain a danger behind prison walls. #3. Richard Allen Davis. The outburst that stunned a nation, the 1993 abduction and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas in Petaluma, California, remains one of the most haunting crimes in American memory. Polly was kidnapped from her bedroom during a slumber party, triggering a massive search that drew volunteers from across the country. For weeks, her face was on every TV screen, every newspaper, every flyer stapled to telephone poles. When her body was discovered, the grief was matched only by fury. Richard Allen Davis, a repeat offender with a long history of violent crime, was arrested after evidence tied him directly to Polly's death. His record read like a rap sheet of escalating brutality: assaults, kidnappings, armed robberies. The fact that he was on parole at the time enraged the public, and led directly to California's 3 strikes law, designed to keep habitual offenders behind bars for life. During the trial, Davis often leaned back in his chair, smirking at testimony, avoiding the eyes of the prosecution and occasionally whispering to his attorneys with what looked like mock amusement. To Polly's family, every smirk felt like another wound. On sentencing day in 1996, the courtroom was overflowing. Supporters of the Class family filled every seat, some holding framed photographs, others wearing buttons with Polly's smiling face. The air was heavy with anticipation and grief. The judge spoke at length, detailing the horror of the crime, the evidence, and the lasting devastation on the community. Then came the announcement: the death penalty, plus life in prison for related charges. For a moment, Davis sat still, his eyes locked on the judge. Then he turned slowly toward the Class family, lips curling into a smirk. What he said next sent shockwaves through the room. Polly told me she wanted to be with me. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps and shouts filled the air. Polly's father lunged forward, fury etched on his face, before deputies grabbed him. Jurors looked away, some visibly trembling. The judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly as she ordered Davis removed from the courtroom. As deputies hauled him toward the side door, Davis laughed, a low, cold laugh that cut through the noise. He smirked one last time before disappearing from view. The outburst was replayed on national news for days, becoming a grim symbol of his cruelty and lack of remorse. For the Class family, the sentence meant he could never hurt anyone again, but his final insult remained a scar. To the public, it confirmed that justice had been served on a man who had shown himself to be beyond redemption. And in that moment, America saw the face of a killer who not only committed an unspeakable crime, but also took a final, needless opportunity to inflict pain on the grieving. Number 2. Dylan Shoemaker. The tears that didn't change the sentence, March 19, 2013, started like any other day for 16-year-old Dylan Shoemaker in the small town of Springville, New York, but by nightfall, it would end in a tragedy that would haunt the community for years. Shoemaker was babysitting his girlfriend's 2-year-old son, Austin Smith, while she worked a shift at a local restaurant. At some point in the evening, Austin began to cry, and according to prosecutors, Shoemaker lost control. In a fit of anger, he struck the toddler repeatedly in the head, causing severe brain injuries. By the time emergency services arrived, it was too late. The case shocked the region, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the youth of the defendant. 16-year-olds are supposed to be worried about homework and sports tryouts, not facing murder charges. From the moment Shoemaker was arrested, the story drew heavy media coverage. Some wondered if he was a violent young man beyond redemption, while others questioned whether immaturity and stress had pushed him into making a catastrophic mistake. At trial, prosecutors were blunt. They read text messages Shoemaker had sent his girlfriend earlier that day, warning her that he was about to lose it with Austin. They described how the injuries could only have been caused by repeated forceful blows. The defense tried to portray Shoemaker as an overwhelmed teenager who had never been taught how to deal with the challenges of childcare, insisting that he hadn't intended to kill Austin. During the proceedings, Shoemaker often sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He avoided looking at the victim's family, who sat just a few feet away, their grief almost tangible. The mother of the child clutched a tissue in one hand and a photo of Austin in the other, her face unreadable but her knuckles white from the grip. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and townspeople who had followed the case from the start. The judge recounted the facts, the texts, the injuries, the irreversible loss, and then pronounced the sentence, 25 years to life in prison. The effect on Shoemaker was immediate. He broke down in loud, heaving sobs, his voice barely coherent through the tears. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he cried out, his shoulders shaking violently. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His words filled the room, but the faces in the gallery remained cold. For them, his tears came far too late. The judge, unmoved, told him plainly that remorse, whether genuine or not, could not undo what had been done. Deputies moved in to escort him from the room. As they led him away, Shoemaker continued to sob, the sound echoing long after the door closed. His breakdown was not the defiance or rage seen in other convicts. It was the hollow collapse of someone realizing that a single night's actions had effectively ended his life as he knew it. Number 1, Ronnie O'Neill 3. The self-destruction of a self-represented killer on a June evening in 2018. The quiet neighborhood of Riverview, Florida, became the scene of one of the most horrifying crimes in the state's history. According to prosecutors, Ronnie O'Neal III attacked his girlfriend, brutally murdered their 9-year-old daughter, attempted to kill his 8-year-old son, who miraculously survived despite critical injuries. The crime scene was described as nothing short of a nightmare. From the moment O'Neal's case began, it was clear this would not be a typical trial. Against all advice, he chose to represent himself, insisting that only he could tell his side of the story truthfully. What followed was part legal proceeding, part theatrical performance. O'Neal shouted at witnesses, interrupted testimony with off-topic rants, and delivered a fiery opening statement in which he claimed he was the victim of a government conspiracy. The most disturbing moment came when O'Neal cross-examined his surviving son, the same child he was accused of trying to kill. The boy, speaking softly, recounted what he had seen that night, his small voice contrasting sharply with his father's booming questions. Jurors looked visibly uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact altogether. When sentencing day arrived in 2021, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Rows of law enforcement officers lined the walls. Families of the victims sat together, many holding hands for support. O'Neal entered in a crisp white shirt, his expression defiant. The judge spoke at length, detailing the overwhelming evidence, the physical injuries, the eyewitness testimony, the forensic results. Her voice was steady as she described the unspeakable cruelty of the crimes. Then came the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a brief moment, O'Neal stood motionless, his eyes locked on the judge. Then the transformation began. His lips pressed into a tight line, his nostrils flared, and he slammed his palm down on the defense table. "This is not justice," he roared. "You're all liars. You know the truth." His voice grew louder with each word, filling the room like a storm. Deputies inched closer, prepared for escalation. O'Neal pointed toward the prosecution, cursing them, then turned toward the gallery, searching for familiar faces. "I'll be back," he shouted. "You hear me? I'll be back." The bravado was there, but it rang hollow, a desperate clinging to the persona he had tried to project throughout the trial. As deputies restrained him and began to lead him toward the holding area, he struggled against their grip, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. The judge, unfazed, continued speaking over the commotion, declaring the proceedings concluded. The door closed and the noise stopped instantly, leaving behind an exhausted silence. For those who had endured the trial, the moment was both a relief and a chilling reminder of the violence O'Neal was capable of. His courtroom meltdown was the final act of a man who had tried to control the narrative and failed. If you found this video fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button and share it so more people can discover these unbelievable courtroom moments. Subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories from around the world. And if you have a case you think should make our next list, drop it in the comments. We're always looking for jaw-dropping stories to feature.